Welcome to Classical Etc., a show that dives into the philosophy, culture, and heart of classical education. You're in the studio with Shane Saxon.
Well, on today's episode of Classical Etc., I'm sitting with Cheryl Swope, the author of Simply Classical, A Beautiful Education for Any Child, and Martin Cothran, who needs no introduction for anyone who listens to these conversations regularly. Now, if someone were to ask me what are the two most important books about classical education, in my kind of, personal experience and opinion, I would name two books. So I would name Climbing Parnassus by Tracy Lee Simmons, a book that I feel like for a lot of people has not only provoked them to take classical education more seriously, but also to think about the role of Latin in classical education. And then second, I tell people this all the time. It's Simply Classical, A Beautiful Education for Any Child. Not only as a book about special education, but as a book about classical education. Maybe the only book-length discussion of the distinctly Memoria Press version of classical education that exists. And it's very compelling. Not just because of that, because it's also a great book. So, Cheryl, let me ask you this question. In the beginning of Tracy Lee Simmons' book, he has this quote. He says, "The tireless study of classics has always been, to put it bluntly, an elite pursuit. As a privilege of a comparative few, we should not skirt this fact. Classical education must not be patronizingly defended, must not be sold for its democratizing traits." So these two books, I think, are two of the most important books on classical ed. Can that quote coexist with your book?
Yes, it can. And I have read that book, and I also love that book. So I address that in Simply Classical. And by the way, thank you for having us.
Yeah.
When we think about classical education, and I had to think about this myself from my children, we have to distinguish it between something that Tracy Lee Simmons does. We have to distinguish this between a classical scholar and classical education. So I think we would all agree that in our classical schools and our classical homeschools, we don't have philologists, is that the word, or classicists. Yeah. We don't have people who will one day translate the Aeneid in the original language. We don't have exclusively those people.
Sure.
That we believe in a classical education because we're sharing a body of knowledge, we're sharing essential skills, reading, writing, arithmetic, and in a classical Christian education, we're also pointing children to Christ. Those things are for any child. So when we think about a classical education, I'm not saying that every child with Down syndrome or dyslexia or autism can become a classical scholar, but I am saying that many of the tenets of classical education can benefit any child.
Mm. So Martin, in that quote, it seems as though Tracy Lee Simmons is trying to guard something that could be lost to kind of a radical democratization. What is he trying to guard our thinking about? And how does that relate to the special education conversation?
Well, I think he's making a distinction between scholarship, properly understood, and classical education, as we're thinking about it. Like Cheryl said, I mean, we're not trying to train people to translate ancient texts. That is among the best students what happens. Mm. We here at Highlands Latin School teach kids how they're translating the Aeneid, but we're not training scholars in that elite sense. We are trying to take the products of scholarship and the scholarship that has been going on for 2,000 years, and we're trying to make that available to a whole nother to each succeeding generation of students. This was what was taught in schools. I mean, even you go back 150 years, and any school, and most people didn't go to school 150 years ago. A lot of people didn't go to school, or only went and basically got basic skills there. But they also got, even in those cases, they got the basic stories of our civilization. If students did not know how to translate Homer, they knew the story of Homer because they had read it in English translations. And so I think that we're talking about a very different thing than scholarship. We're just talking about passing on our civilization. And I think that's what Tracy's talking about in his book.
And so it sounds like, Cheryl, the point that both of you are making is actually a point that's cogent for a traditional neurotypical student or a student that has challenges with learning, right?
Correct. And I think Mrs. Lowe, I brought this quote. Mrs. Lowe said it best. She said, after she read Simply Classical, she said, "A classical education is like climbing a mountain, each child benefiting from whatever vistas he or she attains in that upward journey." So when we start, we don't know how far the child's going to be able to progress, but we begin nonetheless.
And can I say something about just a little story? When we don't accept many outside manuscripts for publication. We plan ahead, and we've got all these things planned to do. And we got Cheryl's in, and Tanya handed it to me, and I looked over and I started going through it, and I'm thinking, well, this is a book on classical education more than it is a book on special education or whatever. And I said, she needs to really focus on the, and in a way I regret saying that, because even after she edited it and made it more explicitly for special needs education, it's still one of the greatest books on classical education that has been printed. And I've often thought, we need to go back to that original manuscript.
and put your name on it. Yeah.
So, it's just funny that's the way that happened. And still, even though it talks about special needs education, it still is. And I've heard, a lot of people say this about the book, that it's that good. And, when you're compared to Climbing Parnassus, it must be.
Well, it is very gratifying because truly I said to my grandma, if it helps one family like ours, then I will be satisfied. And I was just so grateful to Memoria Press for publishing it. But then, yes, you have people like Andrew Kern and Professor Carroll saying, you must read this book. Professor Carroll told a group of hundreds, run, don't walk to the Memoria Press booth. You can just imagine, run and get this book. So yes, I've also heard it called a mother's defense. We're in a situation now in our culture where at least 1 in 5 are diagnosed with something. Now, why that is, I don't know. Is that overdiagnosis or are these true difficulties? But they may be somewhat mild. ADHD, dyslexia, seemingly mild, but those are real challenges in a classical school. So, and also in the homeschool, you have kind of this caricature of who fits in a classical education. And part of my reason for writing the book was to give hope to people who would love to pursue a classical education with their children, even though they don't seem to be the ideal candidate.
Sure. So one of the things that really struck me about your book, kind of branching off from this conversation, is that you weren't just saying special education, could incorporate elements of classical education. You were saying that this is what children who have these challenges need to be doing, that this is the best option for them. Would you explain kind of how you arrived at that conclusion, and then perhaps how that relates to alternative options like that you may have been considering when you were trying to determine what you're going to do with your own children?
There's a lot there. It is sort of a parallel purpose in the book because the book Simply Classical, my background was in progressive ed teacher training. So I was comparing often what I was going to do with my children. But I think there are 3 things that a classical Christian education brings that a progressive education cannot. One is that you are truly transferring a body of knowledge to children. So this contrasts with experiences, projects, and things like that, you may not gain a great deal of knowledge, but the body of knowledge kind of approach I found in Memoria Press when we were homeschooling. We taught Latina Christiana. I knew no Latin, but the three of us together learned introductory Latin. Sure. And then we saw the fruits of that when we were studying English vocabulary. I was able to drop our English vocabulary studies as soon as we were doing Latin. Same with grammar. So it streamlined things for us in a way that mere projects would not have. In fact, the projects would have taken me way more time.
Sure,
sure. So the body of knowledge, also the skills, again, in the more progressive approach, we were taught invented spelling. So you spell the word any way, however you think it should be spelled. That was sort of our approach. In a classical education, you're truly teaching them to spell, to develop penmanship, beautiful penmanship, to learn their math facts, to read and to read well. So the skills, knowledge skills. But then the third with classical Christian education is the leading them to Christ, to the gospel, to an understanding that they are loved, they are made by God, and they are redeemed by him in Christ. That was the focus, the pinnacle, the apex of our education all the way through. And that fruit is the one that that I'm most grateful for. Some listening may know that my son was very, very sick just this last, about 2 weeks ago over the holidays. He was in the hospital. I was with him. And when he came home, he said that he wanted his Christmas, he recovered, thanks be to God, and regained his speech, regained his thinking. And he said that he wanted his Christmas money to go to something that would last. Sure. And I think that it is that understanding that we are forgiven that then leads us to serve. So he wanted all of his Christmas money to go to Ukraine, where the gospel would be preached. He said, I could buy games, a Switch, like my friends, I could buy movies, but I want to do something that lasts. Yeah. I believe his education was foundational in that. And that's something that most special education programs can't give a child because they're held in a secular setting. Yeah.
So Martin, Cheryl's giving an individual example, but it seems like we sometimes are thinking about the big picture and thinking about how is classical education taking a part in cultural renewal. Wouldn't you say that this is a really kind of specific and important way that education can help us achieve that cultural renewal by providing education, high quality education that is actually effective for children with challenges academically?
Well, the body of knowledge that Cheryl refers to, there is a fairly coherent, pretty identifiable body of knowledge that is kind of the common coin of education throughout, ultimately going back a couple thousand years, but more specifically in the last 1,000 years, really, with the recovery of education in the Middle Ages. And that the point I made about that we're passing on a culture, what you mean by, you talk about cultural recovery. I think you said cultural renewal. Yeah. And I guess that's a good, at first I was thinking that's not a good word, renewal, but actually it is. That body of knowledge is just sitting there, largely in our modern schools not being taught. So we have to kind of bring it back. We've had several generations of education in this country when we have not been passing that body of knowledge along. Sure. So, my parents, they got some of the basic stuff because, my dad got, in his little one-room schoolhouse in the hills of South Carolina where they had 3 books, okay? he got that somehow. There were these common reference points that everybody had, and somehow they got that, if not through a book, then through the knowledge of a teacher. But you get past that generation, and it gets very, very weak. And so we have fewer and fewer common reference points. And what that means is that our culture is coming apart. And we're seeing that in a lot of different ways right now, I think, politically and in other ways. And the importance of that, and it's not complicated. That's why it can be taught to special needs children. I mean, really, you take what Cheryl's talking about in her book, that's the same thing you need to be teaching to all kids, really. Right. I mean, kids that don't have special needs may be able to do that at a higher level, but it's the same body of knowledge. Right. That's the thing. And I've used, in reference to Cheryl's book, I've used, the analogy that Mortimer Adler used to use in regard to the different ability levels of students in learning. And he talked about a big glass and a small glass. And he said, a student who is very capable is represented by that large glass. And you pour the best, as he put it, you pour cream in that one, and you don't pour skim milk in the smallest glass, representing the less capable student. You even more want to make sure that what you put in there is every bit as good, if not better, than what you put in the larger glass. And but it's the same stuff that you need to be putting in both the glasses. And so that's why her book is such a good book on classical education, is because really what she's talking about there is just the education we want for everybody, rich, small.
Yeah. Well, and I often quote Martin in talks that I give, because he said this. He said, if a child cannot accommodate the amount or depth of knowledge of most children, it is not less but more important that what he learns be of the highest quality.
I don't remember I said that, but I'll accept the.
You did. It's actually in the. It's in your
introduction.
In your endorsement. Yes, right. But you really did say that. Yeah, and people appreciate that, and the cream analogy. People have referenced that. Mm-hmm.
So it seems like that principle is analogous to another little phrase that we use a lot around here, and that is the Latin phrase "multa non multum." Much, not many. Cheryl, will you explain that phrase, how it relates to the ideas in your book and your view of education?
It is a wonderful phrase, and it's a wonderful tenet, and it saved me from trying to do too many things. And I think not just in education, but also in life, that it's the idea that we want depth and richness, not a mass quantity or a survey approach to literature. We want to take a book and we want to live in that book, as Mrs. Lowe and Lee would say. So that gives the family, especially if you have children with special needs, it gives, or the teacher in the classroom with little time, it gives you the freedom to just enjoy one really good book at a time. So that helped me also. If I needed to only do Latin, math, and piano and literature that day or that week because of medical things or whatever, I knew that was enough, because those things had a depth in them. Of course, starting also with the Holy Scriptures, but those things were enough. And if we were able then to come back to our science and history and other things, then so be it. But we had done our Bible and our hymns, and our math and Latin and our literature, and those things were sufficient.
Yeah, and I think I feel as though you've maybe written this somewhere, or maybe you just said it, but that you see that phrase "multa non multum" as a way of life for you and your family. Is that true? And does it go beyond the education?
It does. We actually have a half-day rule where if we do something for a half of a day, then the other half of a day we will rest. We don't try to do too much, because we're all kind of wired that way, really. My husband and me, we have found that we benefit from that just as much. And not everyone is bent that way. But for us, if we do something one full day, then say some huge outing or some big social event, then normally we need to have the next day be pretty low key. That has helped our family vacations. We went to the Creation Museum and the Ark. We knew we needed to do the Creation Museum first because we wanted to attend lectures. Like Dr. David Menton was there, fabulous lecturer. I let my children look through the microscopes at the feathers. He did this thing called Formed to Fly. That was our focus, was to make sure we got to that lecture. And then the next day for the Ark, we knew they'd be tired, so we just let them sleep. And we went to the Ark and enjoyed that on a much more low-key basis. Just a little example, but yes.
On the multum non multa idea, the idea that, because the problem in our culture, in our education system in particular, is disintegration. That you have a bunch of random topics that are not necessarily related to each other in any evident way, and there's never really any coherent attempt to explain how they are related. Right. And so I think that's the worst problem in modern education and in modern culture in general, is this problem of disintegration. As the poet W.B. Yeats said, things fall apart. And so that's the thing we have to be pushing against constantly, is this disintegrative tendency in things. And this is why a coherent curriculum is really important. I think you see among classical students, they're learning all of these things, and then they're starting to relate things as they get older in their education, so that they can see that this is all connected. The world is not just a world; it's a cosmos. It's a bunch of things, but they all relate to each other in some way. And that's something that just doesn't happen in modern education.
And you would say that a lot of what causes that is trying to do too much. So you can't get to the connections.
Right. Or not studying the central things and really mastering. There are central subjects. And, and if you don't study those and you just have all of these, random topics that populate a modern curriculum, then you're not going to give your children any sense of the fact that everything in this world is connected in some way.
Sure.
Right, because that randomness is inherently disconnected. Right. So we saw the connectedness when our children were right around 14, 15. It was a wonderful thing to start seeing. It was, I think, Narnia is when it was like literature and fantasy and Christianity is all coming together. And my son was having these insights that were just remarkable that I would never have expected back when we were just first teaching him to learn to read.
Sure.
But it bears fruit in the end.
Yeah. And classical education itself is the product of a coming together of two great traditions. The Hebrew tradition of divine revelation and the Greek spirit of rational inquiry brought together in Christianity.
Sure.
And so that's, and there were hundreds of years where that was all worked out, and to see how do these things relate, how do they come together in one thing. And that was the great intellectual and spiritual project of the West. It's what made Western civilization. And classical education is what comes out of that. It's the articulation of all the implications of that. Yeah. And so it is naturally integrative.
Yeah. So a lot of that integration over the centuries occurred in the language of Latin, right?
Yeah.
And it's one of the reasons it's become such an important part of classical education today. So Cheryl, I sometimes feel crazy telling normal, everyday people don't have extraordinary challenges, hey, you should learn Latin, and your kids need to learn Latin. You have been a defender of Latin for children with special needs. Could you make that defense? And how have you felt making that defense over the years? Are you so convinced now that you're not even worried about the responses?
I tend to avoid words like should and must, because what I truly believe is that we are freeing parents to understand that they can do this. So that helps, because I don't feel as if I'm making it an imperative. There are some smaller studies that indicate that the children, even with learning and language-based disabilities, benefit in their native language from learning Latin. Those studies show not just vocabulary, but also their facility with language. That's a boost. That's some evidence. There are some researchers, Sparks is one of them, where they have studied these sorts of things, Latin in particular. So that's helpful. But then also too, like I said, that streamlining is really important, because you do have time limitations, you have stamina limitations for children, often children with special needs. When you have a child with dyslexia, they're working so hard, they're focusing so hard, or a child who has attention difficulties, that they're exhausted after several hours. So if you can do anything to streamline your curriculum, that helps. We do suggest that we start a little later with Latin, after phonics are good and solid. And sometimes that takes longer. So in ours, we have Simply Classical 1, 2, and 3 that are focused on reading fluently in English. And then by the time in our Simply Classical curriculum, that is, when we get to level 4, we start with Prima Latina. And then we take longer to cover Latina Christiana. I needed to with my kiddos. So we eventually get to covering first form Latin in Simply Classical, the curriculum, but that's all. So again, but that's okay. The amount of Latin that we studied was less, but it was no less beneficial.
And this kind of brings us back to your original question about, okay, so if you're not teaching, trying to develop scholars, then why are you having them teach Latin? That would have been the first question I would have asked. Well, you kind of have to look at the history of education in this country in the last 200 years to really understand that, where you had up until the end of the 19th century, in order to read Homer's Iliad and Odyssey or Virgil's Aeneid, you had to know Latin and Greek to do it, because there really weren't many English translations only come in of those books at the end of the 19th century, really. And so that's what you had to do to read those books.
Right.
But since we have the translations, kind of part of what that brought about was the whole questioning of, okay, so if we have all these English translations of these books now, why are we teaching English and Latin in the schools? And this is one of the things that brought down classical education in the early part of the 20th century, was that question and the inability of the really smart scholars to defend themselves on that. And they finally, near the end of the debate, realized what their argument was, but it was too late. And the argument was, it develops the mind.
Yes.
And they didn't have the research to prove it either by then either. We really kind of know this now, that studying a language like Latin, which is very structured and organized and systematic, that helps make your mind organized and structured and systematic.
Yes. And, I'm largely anecdotal here, so and I understand that. But I remember my son Michael, he said, Latin takes my boggled mind and sorts it out.
Yeah.
And it is the Latin and math for both of them. I knew that my daughter, who has the math disability, I knew that she was not going to become an engineer, a mathematician, a carpenter, anything related to math. But it was the discipline of the mind that was so important, and still is. They both still.
Well, the Latin math comparison is important because you could ask the same questions about math. Why are you doing math?
And people do.
About Latin. People do.
Right.
As about Latin. Because if you want to know, people are out there talking about critical thinking skills. They have no clue what they're talking about, but they promote it. And the bottom line answer to the question, how do I teach my kids critical thinking skills, is teach them Latin and math.
And any child
literature.
that needs critical thinking skills.
Any child, correct.
Yeah. Yeah. So you just brought up literature, and I think that's going to factor into our final question here. One of the things I've always admired about you, Cheryl, is that you do seem to be aware of much of the medical research and the terminology, and you've taken, in my opinion, maybe you're doing more than I see, I'm sure you are, but a much not many approach even to your intellectual interest, that you've gone deep into special education and incorporating that with classical education. What should the role of medical research be in how we think about educating our children? I think some people might accuse classical educators as being anti-science sometimes, which we're obviously not, but that accusation does get levied. So how do we think about this? How do we think about the other ways that we come to understand truth, like literature and beauty? What do you think of that question?
Well, first, we're definitely not anti-science. There's the trivium, there's the quadrivium, and thankfully that's all being developed now, not just in theory in our writings, but also in our schools. So I hope that we will not be defending that accusation, that we're not just the humanities, never have been. It's always been a very, as Martin would say, balanced. We have the mathematical languages, which include science. We have the language arts. The mathematical arts and the language arts. But to your question about medical research, I think it's really important. I work with schools too. One of the questions is often, why should we give some students more time on their tests than others? How is that fair, for example? Well, there is some medical research that shows that children who have a processing difficulty thinking quickly and processing information and then getting it out, whether it's auditory processing or visual processing, they benefit from extra time on tests. However, the average student doesn't. If you give 2 hours for a test, most kids will end up dawdling or it does not benefit the average child. But the child who has processing difficulties truly benefits from that extra time. So what some of our classical schools have done is to provide a testing center or a resource person who can do tutoring, small group instruction, but she can also provide a place where a child can take a test for 45 minutes, also in quiet. A lot of students with attention difficulties, they're distractible. So they just need their headphones, their quiet place. They can take the same test. It's the same body of knowledge. And yet that's a helpful defense to the other parents who are saying, well, why can't my child have that? And usually the adept headmaster will say, if your child needs that, then that's what we'll provide. Sure. But if he doesn't, we don't want to be giving him something that will actually hold him back.
It seems like both of you have cultivated some wisdom and ability to navigate this data and these studies in a way that I think some people find difficult. Martin, you've written about this. A study has shown fallacy. That speaks to your kind of wisdom in approaching the different onslaught of data. Could you both just give some advice to educators and parents who are trying to sort through that data? How can they cultivate wisdom when they're approaching information?
Well, I would say that you just have to be very, very careful. There's a lot of literature coming out now on the problem in the sciences with research. There was a book that came out by Richard Harris, and I'm blanking on the name of it, but he was the science reporter for National Public Radio for many years, and he makes the point in talking about the replication crisis, that you have all these studies out there that it was just one study and it was never redone to make sure that it was legitimate. Most studies, over 60% of studies that are replicated, are found to be faulty. But we don't know that because they just throw them out there. And of course, the average layman does not know that. Sure. But he documents the problem that even in the hard sciences, he's talking about biomedicine and how even in the hard sciences, the research is bad. And then you get into the softer sciences, you get into psychology, where only 5% of studies are replicated in psychology, and education, where 0.13% of the studies in education are even replicated, which is the basic research criterion. So just because there's a study on something out there, you really can't conclude anything from that unless you look at that study, see if it's been replicated. There's a lot of of hurdles that good research has to jump, and most of them haven't gone through the process. So we're very credulous about that whole study has found problem.
Right. And I think, too, that in the soft sciences, it's difficult to replicate because you have the human factor. You have the child, but you also have the teacher. Does the child love the teacher? If he did, would he be responding differently?
Sure.
And all of those things are impossible to measure through studies. So,
Yeah. Well, I've really enjoyed this conversation. For anyone listening to this who has not read Simply Classical, Cheryl Swope's book, you should. You absolutely need to. So purchase a copy. Thank you both for having this conversation. I really enjoyed it.
thank you, Shane.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Classical Etc. If you'd like to show your support for the show, then you can leave a like below. If you'd like to add your voice to the conversation, then you can comment. And if you want to follow along with us on this journey, then please subscribe. Thanks, and I'll see you later.